I was working at a tourist information desk in Amsterdam when an American couple walked up holding a printed map upside down. The woman pointed at what she thought was the Anne Frank house and asked how long it would take to walk there. I flipped the map right side up for her. Turns out she was pointing at the central train station. They'd been walking in circles for 2 hours. The husband looked at me and said, "Well, the buildings all look the same." Anyway, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I've spent years collecting these real travel moments. Most people would never believe, and I break them down here so you can see what's really going on beneath the surface. If you value stories with context over quick laughs, you belong here. Another day, same desk. A guy from Texas asked me where he could find the Eiffel Tower. I told him that was in Paris. He stared at me like I'd just told him the sky was green. "But we're in Europe," he said. "Can't I just take a quick train?" I explained that Paris was about 500 kilometers away. He looked annoyed and said, "Why didn't they build these cities closer together?" His girlfriend nodded along like this was a reasonable complaint. My coworker had a similar moment in Prague. She was giving directions to the castle when an American tourist interrupted her. "Do they accept dollars up there?" he asked. She said no, they use Czech crowns. He got visibly frustrated and said, "That's so inconvenient. Why doesn't Europe just use one currency?" She had to explain that the euro exists, but the Czech Republic uses its own money. He walked away, muttering something about how confusing everything was. Then there was the time in Rome. I was visiting a friend who worked near the Colosseum. An American woman asked him if the Colosseum was built specifically for tourists. Like, she genuinely thought modern Italy constructed it as an attraction. When he explained it was nearly 2,000 years old, she seemed disappointed. "Oh," she said, "so it's not the original then?" My friend had to take a moment to process that question. These moments happen more than you'd think. I've seen American tourists ask if Big Ben runs on batteries. I've watched someone try to tip a gondolier in Venice with Monopoly money they thought was euros. I once overheard a conversation where someone asked why Europeans made their streets so narrow that cars barely fit. The answer, of course, is that the streets existed long before cars did. The thing is, none of these people are trying to be difficult. They're just experiencing a completely different way of life, and it's throwing them off. When you grow up in a country where everything is big, new, and spread out, visiting places where everything is old, compact, and layered with history creates some genuine confusion. The result? Stories that sound made up, but are absolutely real. Most people hear stories like this and just laugh. I connect the dots. How culture, language, and expectation collide in ways that reveal something deeper about how we travel and think. If you want that kind of clarity on tap, subscribe. It's how you stay ahead of the surface level stuff. I was working as a tour guide in Barcelona when a group of Americans asked if we could make a quick detour to see the Leaning Tower of Pisa. I told them that was in Italy, about 900 kilometers away. One woman looked at her phone and said, "But Google Maps says it's only 8 hours by car. That's not far." I had to explain that 8 hours is actually quite far, especially when you're on a walking tour of Barcelona. She seemed genuinely surprised that European cities weren't all within an hour of each other. Another guide I know had a similar experience in London. An American family asked him if they could walk to Stonehenge after seeing Buckingham Palace. He explained it was about 2 hours away by car. The dad looked confused and said, "But we're in England. How big can it be?" My friend pulled up a map and showed them. England might look small compared to Texas, but distances still matter when you're on foot. The map confusion gets deeper. I was helping tourists in Vienna when someone asked me why their GPS kept switching languages. I looked at their phone. They'd accidentally set their destination to a place in Slovakia. They'd crossed an international border without realizing it because there were no checkpoints. "Wait," the guy said. "We're in a different country now?" "Yes. Welcome to the Schengen zone." He was amazed that you could just walk between countries like that. My sister worked at a hotel in Munich. An American guest came to the front desk upset because his phone said he was in Germany, but he thought he was supposed to be in Bavaria. She had to explain that Bavaria is part of Germany. He looked embarrassed, but then asked, "So is Munich like the capital of Bavaria or something?" She confirmed it was. He nodded and said, "That makes sense, I guess. But why isn't it called Bavaria then?" She didn't have an answer that would satisfy him. Then there was the couple in Copenhagen who asked their tour guide if they could see the northern lights that evening. The guide explained that Copenhagen is too far south and it was the wrong time of year. The woman looked disappointed and said, "But we're in Scandinavia. Isn't that where the northern lights are?" "Technically, yes, but you need to go much further north and wait for the right conditions." They seemed to think Scandinavia was one small region where everything was close together. I heard about a case in Switzerland where American tourists were confused about why people spoke different languages in different cities. They visited Zurich, where people spoke German, then went to Geneva, where people spoke French. One of them asked, "Do they teach everyone multiple languages here, or do they just switch depending on who's visiting?" The guide explained that Switzerland has 4 official languages, and different regions speak different ones. The tourists seemed to think this was unnecessarily complicated. Another friend worked at a train station in Brussels. An American asked her which train goes to the chocolate factory. She asked which one. He said, "You know, the famous one." She tried to explain that Belgium has many chocolate shops and factories. He got frustrated and said, "The one from the movie." She realized he was thinking of Willy Wonka and had to tell him that wasn't a real place. He looked genuinely disappointed. The distance thing comes up constantly. I was at a cafe in Paris when I overheard Americans planning their day. They wanted to see the Eiffel Tower, visit the Louvre, take a trip to Versailles, pop over to the French Riviera, and be back for dinner. Their itinerary would have required about 16 hours of travel time. When the waiter gently suggested they might want to pick just 2 or 3 things, they seemed annoyed that Paris wasn't more compact. A tour guide in Athens told me about tourists who were upset that the Parthenon was falling apart. They asked if there were plans to fix it. She explained that it's an ancient ruin and it's preserved as is. One person said, "But shouldn't they restore it so it looks new again?" She had to explain that would destroy its historical value. They didn't seem convinced. "Back home we just rebuild it," someone said. That's kind of the point of preservation, though. I saw something similar in Dublin. American tourists were disappointed that many of the old buildings were only from the 1800s. One person said, "That's not even that old. We have buildings from the 1700s back home." The Irish guide smiled and said, "Yes, but we have texts from the 6th century and ruins from the Bronze Age." The tourists seemed to recalculate what old meant in Europe. Was working at a restaurant in Florence when an American family finished their meal and left a huge pile of coins on the table. My coworker looked confused. They'd left about €3 in change. The bill was €40. I had to run after them to let them know they'd underpaid. They were mortified. Turns out, they thought the coins were tips, and the service charge on the receipt covered the actual bill. They'd misunderstood the entire payment structure. We sorted it out, but they were so embarrassed. Another server I know had the opposite problem. Americans would leave massive tips, like 15 to €20 on a €30 bill. He'd try to give some back, explaining that tipping isn't expected like that in Italy. They'd insist he keep it. He felt awkward because it seemed like they thought service was bad unless they tipped American style. He appreciated the generosity, but wished they understood that servers make actual wages here. The money confusion goes beyond tipping. I watched an American tourist in Berlin try to pay for a €5 coffee with a €50 note at a small cafe. The owner asked if he had anything smaller. He said no, that was his smallest bill. The owner explained she couldn't make change that big at 8 in the morning. The tourist seemed annoyed and said, "Don't you guys use credit cards?" She did, but her card reader was broken. He ended up having to find an ATM. My friend worked at a market in Budapest. An American tourist tried to pay in euros. My friend said they only accept Hungarian forints. The tourist looked confused and said, "But Hungary is in Europe." My friend explained that not all European countries use the euro. The tourist asked why not. My friend gave a brief explanation about national currencies and economic policy. The tourist said, "That seems really complicated for no reason." My friend just smiled and nodded. Then there's the cash versus card divide. I was in a small village in Portugal when I saw American tourists get frustrated that a tiny family restaurant didn't accept cards. They said, "Everything takes cards in America. Why is Europe so behind?" The owner, who spoke some English, calmly explained that they're a small business and card fees eat into their profits. The tourists seemed to think this was an excuse rather than a legitimate reason. A bartender in Prague told me about tourists who'd argue about prices. They'd convert everything to dollars in their heads and complain that things seemed expensive. He'd try to explain that you can't just do straight conversion without considering local wages and living costs. They didn't want to hear it. One person said, $5 for a beer is outrageous. The bartender said, "It's $3. The guy had used the wrong conversion rate. I witnessed something similar in Stockholm. An American couple was shocked that a casual meal cost about 30 euros per person. They kept saying how cheap food is back home. A Swedish diner overheard and said, "Yes, but we don't tip, and our servers earn good wages." The Americans didn't make the connection that the higher menu prices include fair compensation for workers. They just thought Stockholm was overpriced. There was also the ATM incident in Vienna. An American tourist used an ATM and was confused why it gave him euros instead of dollars. He actually went into the bank to complain. The teller patiently explained that Austrian ATMs dispense euros because that's the local currency. He said, "But can't it just give me dollars and do the conversion?" She said, "No, that's not how international banking works." He left, still looking confused. My co-worker in Amsterdam had a guest ask if they could pay their hotel bill in dollars. She said they could, but the exchange rate would be unfavorable. He said that was fine. He didn't want to deal with funny money. She processed it, but he ended up paying about 15% more than if he'd just used a card or exchanged currency properly. When he saw the total, he was upset. She tried to explain, but he'd already authorized the payment. Another common issue is not understanding VAT. I can't count how many times I've seen Americans shocked at checkout when the price is higher than the shelf price. In Europe, tax is included in the displayed price, but Americans are used to tax being added at the register. I've watched people argue with cashiers thinking they're being overcharged. The cashier has to explain that the price includes tax. The American usually says something like, "Why don't you just show the price without tax, then add it?" Because that would be the same total and also more confusing. A shop owner in Rome told me about an American who wanted a tax refund on a €5 souvenir. The owner explained that VAT refunds only apply to purchases over a certain amount and require specific paperwork. The tourist insisted that in America, you can return anything. The owner tried to clarify the difference between a return and a tax refund. The conversation went in circles until the tourist gave up. I was working at a museum in Athens when an American visitor asked when they built the replica of the Parthenon. I was confused by the question. I said it's not a replica, it's the original. He looked at me skeptically and said, "But it's so old. Wouldn't they have rebuilt it by now?" I explained that preservation means keeping it as close to original as possible. He seemed to think this was impractical. "Wouldn't it be better to rebuild it so people can see what it actually looked like?" he asked. That's what artists' reconstructions are for. Another museum guide told me about tourists who were disappointed that they couldn't touch the artifacts. One woman said, "In America, museums are interactive. Why is everything behind glass here?" The guide explained these were priceless ancient objects. The woman said, But how are we supposed to really experience them? The guide suggested using her eyes. The woman didn't appreciate the sarcasm. Then, there was the cathedral situation in Paris. I was visiting Notre Dame before the fire and overheard Americans talking about how they should update the interior. One person said it looked too dark and old-fashioned. His friend agreed and said they should add more lighting and maybe some modern art. A French woman nearby looked horrified. She said, "It's meant to look like this. It's 800 years old." The Americans seemed to think old meant it needed renovation. My friend worked at a castle in Scotland. American tourists would ask if people still lived there. She'd explain that some castles are still private residences, but this one is a museum. They'd ask why someone doesn't just buy it and fix it up. She'd explain it's a protected historical site with strict preservation rules. They seemed baffled that you couldn't just renovate a castle like you'd remodel a house. A tour guide in Berlin told me about Americans who were uncomfortable with how much World War II history is preserved. One person said, "Why do they keep bringing it up? It was so long ago." The guide explained that remembering history is crucial to preventing it from repeating. The tourist said, "But it makes everything feel so heavy. Can't we just focus on the nice stuff?" The guide politely explained that wasn't how historical preservation works in Germany. Then there's the bathroom situation. I worked at a tourist site in Italy, where you had to pay 50 cents to use the bathroom. Americans would get so frustrated. "Bathrooms are free in America," they'd say. I'd explain that maintenance costs money and public bathrooms aren't funded the same way here. One person told me it should be illegal to charge for bathrooms. I just collected the coins and handed over toilet paper. Another issue is opening hours. I can't tell you how many times I've seen Americans upset that shops close for lunch or that museums aren't open late. I was in a small town in Spain when tourists were annoyed that everything shut down from 2 to 5. They said, "This is prime tourist time. Why would you close?" A local explained that people go home for lunch and rest. It's part of the culture. The tourists thought this was bad for business. A hotel worker in Greece told me about guests who complained that things were too old in their historic hotel room. They wanted modern furniture and updated bathrooms. She tried to explain that the hotel's charm was its historical character. They said they didn't care about charm, they wanted convenience. She eventually moved them to a modern hotel chain. They were much happier there. I witnessed Americans in Copenhagen get confused about the lack of air conditioning in older buildings. It was a warm day and they were upset their Airbnb was hot. The host explained that most old buildings don't have AC because it's rarely needed, and installation is complicated in historical structures. The guests said, "Just put in a window unit." The host explained that external modifications aren't allowed in that neighborhood. The guests left a bad review. Another time in Prague, I saw tourists disappointed that a medieval square wasn't wheelchair accessible. They had a point about accessibility being important, but they seemed to think the entire square should be redesigned. A local tried to explain that these streets are hundreds of years old and built on uneven terrain. The tourists said, "In America, we just fix it." The local said, "You destroy the history in the process." There was also the restaurant incident in Paris. Americans wanted to eat dinner at 6 p.m. The restaurant didn't open until 7. They were annoyed and asked why the hours were so limited. The owner explained that French people eat later and the kitchen staff needs preparation time. The American said, "The customer is always right, though." The owner smiled and said, "In France, the chef is always right." A guide in Vienna told me about tourists who asked if the buildings were inspired by Disney. She had to explain that it was the other way around. Disney's designers were inspired by European architecture. The tourists seemed surprised. One said, "So Disney didn't invent castles?" The guide took a deep breath and gave a brief history of medieval architecture. Was working my last shift at that Amsterdam information desk when an American couple came in with the most ambitious itinerary I'd ever seen. They wanted to visit 12 countries in 14 days. Each day was packed with 4 or 5 major attractions. I looked at their schedule and realized they'd planned about 30 minutes per location, including travel time. I gently suggested they might want to slow down and actually experience places rather than just photographing them. The husband looked at his wife and said, "But then we won't be able to tell people we went to all these countries." That moment stuck with me. Sometimes the sightseeing struggle isn't about confusion or misunderstanding. It's about fundamentally different approaches to travel. American culture often emphasizes efficiency, quantity, and checking boxes. European culture tends to emphasize experience, quality, and taking time. Neither is wrong, but they clash in funny ways. My friend in Rome said she once saw an American tourist sprint through the Sistine Chapel, taking photos without ever looking up at the actual ceiling. When someone pointed this out, he said, "I can look at the photos later." He'd traveled thousands of miles to see one of humanity's greatest artistic achievements and experienced it entirely through a phone screen. Another guide told me about tourists who spent an entire tour of the Louvre trying to find the best angle for their Instagram photo with the Mona Lisa. They waited in line for 30 minutes, took their photo in 10 seconds, and left. They never actually looked at the painting. When asked if they wanted to see other artworks, they said they'd already got what they came for. These stories might sound critical, but they're really about culture shock working both ways. Europeans are equally confused when they visit America and find that distances are huge, tipping is mandatory, and everything closes at 9 p.m. The difference is just what seems normal based on where you grew up. I'll say this, though, despite all the confusion, map mishaps, and money mix-ups, the Americans I met were almost always friendly and well-meaning. They were just trying to navigate a world that works differently than what they know. And honestly, that's what makes these stories funny instead of frustrating. We're all just humans trying to figure out places we don't fully understand. That's the lens I bring to every story here. Real travel, real people, zero judgment. I'll keep unpacking these moments whether you subscribe or not. But the people who do, they're the ones who see the world a little differently after every video. The sightseeing habits might be different, but the desire to see the world and experience new things is universal, even if sometimes that means walking around Amsterdam with your map upside down for 2 hours. Trust me, these stories never stop coming, and every single one reminds me that travel is as much about the confusion as it is about the destination.